Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the launch of a new report, Understanding and Addressing Inflation in Manitoba. My name is Molly McCracken. I am the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Manitoba Office Director and your host here today. We just have a couple more people joining us. Karen is doing our tech here. Thank you so much, Karen. And it's great to see all of you here. Karen, I'm wondering if you're going to pin the speakers, spotlight the speakers video. Yeah, so we are broadcasting today from Treaty 1 territory, the heartland of the Métis people. We acknowledge that our water is supplied from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation territory. And the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives is Canada's leading progressive research institute. We are an independent and charitable organization active in Manitoba since 1997, and this year marks our 25th anniversary here in the province. And certainly there's so much happening right now and a lot of talk about inflation, and that makes Jesse's report launch today very important and timely. It explains the rising prices of goods and services and how and when governments should respond to higher inflation to help Manitobans, particularly those on low income or with fixed income and limited savings. And Jesse identifies targeted interventions and what allied organizations, labor and workers can call for from governments. So shortly, I'm going to introduce Jesse. I did want to just talk a little bit about our format. We're going to have a presentation from Jesse Hager for about 10-ish minutes. And then we have a couple of questions for him directly. I'm really pleased to also introduce Niall Harney, who's the new senior researcher, Errol Black Chair in Labor Issues with our office. He'll be asking a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions. So at that time, we'll stop the recording. And then you're welcome to ask questions by raising your hand over video, or you can put questions in the chat and we will try and get to all the questions in the chat. And we ask, of course, that questions be asked respectfully. So yeah, now I'll introduce Jesse. Jesse is an assistant professor in economics and labor studies at the University of Manitoba. His fields of specialization include political economy and public policy, the social economy and CED, poverty and inequality, and he is a research associate with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Manitoba. So I'll hand it over to you, Jesse.
Thanks, Molly. The rising cost of living in Canada, this is no secret. Prior to the Russian invasion in Ukraine, rising cost of living was probably the #1 media story that we were hearing about day in and day out. The most recent data that we have for Manitoba shows that comparing January of 2022 to January of 2021, prices have gone up by 5.5%. So this is relatively high compared to the levels that we've been used to for the past few decades. And if we think about the overall pre-pandemic period, we were normally in the range of 0 to 4% when it came to monthly inflation data. Now, the rising price of goods and services is an important policy issue. It impacts people's standard of living, particularly those of lesser means, Molly, as you've mentioned. Higher inflation can be particularly stressful for those who are low income or living off fixed incomes or savings. And when prices go up, if your income isn't going up at the same time, it's going to be harder to afford the goods and services that you could before, and that's going to reduce your standard of living. Also, given that many Canadians are living paycheck to paycheck, this is going to lead to some tough decisions for families. What do you cut in the household budget? When you're living in poverty, when you have no wiggle room in your household budget, you're left with these impossible choices. Do you pay the rent, or do you buy food? Or do you cut other necessities? When we think of higher inflation, it's often portrayed as a problem for everybody. But inflation can have mixed impacts and complex impacts across the socioeconomic spectrum. For example, while fixed income households are at the most risk of not being able to afford their basic needs, those with high amounts of debt actually can see some improvements in their relative wealth when it comes to inflation, if their incomes are going up at the same time.
Should have had a better chance. I mean, sorry, I shouldn't have went with students in the beginning.
We have many income tested benefits in Canada, and some of those go up with inflation. The federal benefits in particular, the ones that people rely on the most, like the federal seniors benefits and child benefits, those are indexed to rise with inflation. So the impact of inflation is somewhat complicated. Manitoba's Rent Assist program is an example of a program that also rises with inflation, is important, but EIA, our social assistance program, isn't otherwise indexed to inflation. So all these things factor into what is the impact of inflation and what should we do about it. The focus of this report is on policy alternatives for responding to these types of problems, these pressures. It's important to understand that there are many different policy options out there to deal with inflation and affordability issues more broadly. There are choices to be made, and the choices we do make are going to impact different groups in society differently. It's going to determine who bears the burden. So, for example, there's been some public representatives on the right of the political spectrum who have blamed government deficits and generous pandemic benefits, as well as support from the Bank of Canada in keeping interest rates low for the inflation. If you're going to reverse those programs, you're going to have a negative impact on not only the economy, but you're going to have the problem being solved on the backs of workers. So those are the type of issues that we look at in this report. The report outlines some of the important facts about inflation, what the recent increases look like, what are the causes, and what are the distributional consequences of different policy responses. I try to explain why the more commonly proposed inflation-fighting measures disproportionately burden workers and lower income populations. And the report presents policy alternatives for responding to inflation that would be better for these more vulnerable groups in the ongoing context of the pandemic and the economic recovery from the pandemic. I also pay special attention to what's going on here in Manitoba. So what are the key findings from the report? The first one is there are multiple reasons for higher inflation, but most of them are related to the pandemic and are likely going to be temporary. The second key finding is that inflation is often tied to a booming economy. So rather than thinking of it as a cause, it's often a symptom of some bigger things that are happening. So if the economy is doing really well, the bargaining power of labor is going to be high, and that can reduce economic inequality. So we have to be careful when responding to inflation that we don't stamp out these benefits. What we have seen in the data is that workers are keeping up on average. Raising interest rates and cutting government spending to try and reduce inflation very quickly would hurt workers. It would harm equity, and it could put at risk the economic recovery. And there's alternatives to that approach that exist, and I'll go through some of those today. A final key finding is that not all workers are seeing wage gains in line with inflation. And in particular, unionized workers, paradoxically, who had collective agreements and had wages set at lower levels based on earlier expectations about prices, or maybe they're under a wage freeze if they work for the provincial government, for example, they're doing very poorly in this environment because costs are going up, but their built-in wage increases are very low. So what is happening with inflation in Manitoba? what I have up here is the annual inflation rate. So how much prices have increased in 2021 compared to 2020. And the way, this is the more typical way of measuring inflation. You look at how much did prices increase in one year compared to the previous year. And for 2021, we saw prices go up by 3.3%. Now, as can be seen here, the price increases aren't the same in every category. So shelter, for example, went up by 4.6%. We saw transportation costs go up by quite a bit, and a big part of that was the huge increase in gasoline prices that we saw in 2021. Now, that increase needs to be put in context, however. If we look at what happened the year before, in the year of the pandemic, we actually saw record low inflation. So prices in 2020 only went up by 0.5%. We saw, for example, the price of gasoline falling by almost 14%. So if we think of the pandemic period as a whole, what we're seeing happening is a catch-up in prices. We saw prices being suppressed in the first year of the pandemic. People were stuck at home. They were increasing their savings significantly because they were limited in how they spent that money. In 2021, we saw a very rapid recovery, and that partially led to the inflation that we're seeing today. So that's one explanation for what's happening with inflation. Before I go on to others, I just want to highlight that 3.1%, 3.3%, those rates are the annual rates. Those aren't the rates that we're hearing every month on the news. What we're hearing on the news is what's called the year-over-year inflation rate. And that looks at the price in 1 month of a year and compares that to the same month in the previous year. Now, because the inflation in Manitoba has been concentrated very heavily in the last part of 2021, these year-over-year rates are much higher. So if you look at the overall rate here for Manitoba, comparing January of 2022 to January of 2021, prices have gone up by 5.5%. And food and shelter, we can see down the list here that those price increases are a bit higher. But we can do the same thing here and average those price increases over 2 years. And again, we see that the increases are more modest. They're higher than the annual rates, but they're not as extreme when we take a longer period view. It's also important to keep in perspective, how inflation is comparing today to what we've seen historically. So this is the year-over-year inflation rate for Manitoba, and we can certainly see at the end there, the most recent data is pushing up above where we were at for the last couple of decades. But you look back to the 1980s, for example, and inflation was right around what it is now. It was even higher in the early 80s and the 1970s. So we're not at a point of crisis here. The type of inflation crisis we saw in the late 1970s is still a very long way off. And that's important to keep in mind when reacting to the current inflation. So we talked about catch-up over the pandemic being a reason for the inflation that we're seeing now. We also saw during the pandemic a rapid return to previous household spending levels. So spending contracted, but spending actually recovered and increased much quicker than people expected. We also saw that increase in spending being concentrated in goods, and that makes sense, right? People can't go to the symphony, they can't go to the sports games, they can't go see the Bombers, at least at first. And so they had a bunch of money to spend. The federal government was very successful with its income support programs. We actually saw incomes go up in 2020, which is unusual for a recessionary year. So people had money to spend. They were saving a big chunk of it, but they actually started spending a lot more on goods pretty quickly by the summer of 2020. So this wasn't just happening in Canada. This was happening all over. It's happening in the United States. And this led to some serious problems in the supply chain for goods. Producers scaled back pretty significantly. They thought this recession was going to be going on for a long time, but suddenly demand came back really quickly. So we see problems at ports, problems with manufacturers of computer chips who said, oh, we're not going to be selling many cars, so we're going to shift that production to computers, chips for something else. Now they're realizing, oh, wait, we overcompensated. So that's also contributing to this increase in prices. The third reason that we're seeing prices go up, though, is because of corporations raising prices. So not only are corporations raising prices to cover the increase in their production costs, what we've seen is from analyses in the United States that corporate profits are increasing even more than costs. Basically, what's happening is we have corporations being able to use the pandemic and the recent inflation not only to pass on the higher costs they're facing, but to raise their profit margins. We see here in this graph, Canadian corporate profits surging during the pandemic, increasing between 39% by 39% between the last quarter of 2019 and the third quarter of 2021. And if we compare 2019 before tax quarterly profits, profits during the pandemic have been 28% higher. So there's certainly some profiteering happening right now at the expense of consumers. So how do we respond to inflation? There's a few things we want to think about from a policy perspective. We want to think about that different impact on different groups. We want to think not just about prices, but about incomes. So I spoke earlier about how wages have been going up even more than inflation on average. So that's something important to think about. But we also want to think about those who are on fixed incomes, who are on government benefits as well, and to make sure that that's keeping up. I talked about the debt position, how inflation actually has a progressive impact on the distribution of wealth. So it's not all bad. We need to think about these things. We also have to think about, how high is the inflation, how wide is it spread, and how long is it expected to persist. Now, I go into this in detail in the report, but as I've already shown, the current inflation, while higher than it's been over the last few decades, is still relatively moderate by historic norms. We've also seen the inflation concentrated in a few volatile sectors. It's gas prices, it's the goods being produced at the international level that are really driving this. And raising interest rates in Canada, it's not going to lower the price of gas, right? So we need to think about that. And the Bank of Canada and our own Manitoba Bureau of Statistics, the forecasters are projecting that the inflation that we're seeing now is going to start to subside over the next year or two on its own as these supply chain issues work their way out. So we don't necessarily want to overreact right now by jacking up interest rates or cutting government spending because we're worried about inflation. By the time that works its way through the system, you're going to end up with inflation solving itself anyways, and you could create all these extra problems by doing that. So monetary policy, raising interest rates, fiscal policy, cutting government spending, I don't think is advisable at this point in history. It could undermine those gains that we're seeing for workers right now in this high growth context. And we still have a huge social deficit in so many areas when it comes to government spending. So it doesn't make sense, in my opinion, to be looking at these type of macroeconomic solutions. I think the solutions we should be looking at are making sure our income supports are indexed to inflation. So in Manitoba, we have our social assistance program where the basic needs budget is not only incredibly inadequate and leaves people in deep poverty, but it doesn't go up when prices go up. I think the most fruitful or the greatest area for opportunity is increasing the public provision of essential goods and services. we can think of many areas of our economy, many areas of consumer purchases where costs are left up to the consumer still in areas that do have large public sector provision operators, so in healthcare and education, but there's still many gaps. So we can think about healthcare, for example, mental health and the coverage of prescription drugs. We're completely out of line with our international peers on this, with a lack of public coverage under our Medicare system. Improving public investment in these areas would significantly support households who are struggling with these costs. And not only that, study after study has shown that public provision in these areas are going to reduce the overall cost. For prescription drugs, for example, that public provision helps counterbalance the power of these large multinational sellers of pharmaceuticals. Childcare, one of the highest social returns on investment you can get from a social program. Canada, again, completely behind its peers when it comes to the quality and access to early childhood education. So there's some progress being made on that right now, but certainly much more we can do. In education in Manitoba, we've seen funding cut in real terms, not keeping up with inflation, and this is leading to schools really struggling. We know that there's special needs within schools that are going unmet. We know that families are more and more having to turn to private services if they can afford it, for tutoring and that kind of thing. Much better to help families' bottom line and improve equity by making sure our schools have the resources they need to provide those services publicly. Climate change, huge pressing problem, obviously. There's many areas, free public transit, helping families more with energy efficiency retrofits, the transition to electric vehicles. I talk about this in more detail in the report, but these are all areas which have strong cases from an economic efficiency standpoint, but consumers need that help to get there, to get the financing they need to do this, and we need a big push from governments to make this happen on a large scale. So we can not only help families deal with rising costs by moving away from fossil fuels and making our homes and businesses more efficient, but we can actually help address the climate crisis at the same time. Telecommunications is another area which is really a basic need now, right? You can't participate in the workforce, get a job, or succeed in education without access to the internet. But in Canada, we still face some of the highest costs for accessing these essential services. We used to have a public provider in Manitoba. It was sold off by the government in the 1990s. We look to our neighbor Saskatchewan, who still has a public provider, and their costs are so much lower than what we face here. So these are all areas where we can look at taking action to reduce affordability challenges for households in Manitoba. Two other areas that are talked about in the report are looking at antitrust or competition regulation, restraining corporate power, which has allowed for them to be increasing prices at such a high rate during the pandemic, as well as a last resort, price controls. Price controls are usually seen as a fairly extreme measure, but we have them in Manitoba in some areas. You look at supply managed goods, rent regulation, they've been shown to be quite effective. So that is another tool that governments could use if necessary. The final part of the report looks at the implications for the labor movement and how they should position themselves in response to this high inflation area. Not all workers are seeing wage gains in line with or above inflation, and particularly unionized workers. Ironically, healthcare workers have only seen a 1.5 increase in average weekly wages between January 2020 and January 2022. So not all workers are benefiting from the tight labor market. And so this is an area where some change is needed. Governments are going to see their revenues increase with inflation. They can address these long-standing issues of low wages arising from the government wage freeze. It's going to be complicated for labor because you don't want to over fight for protection from inflation in your collective agreements, because, as I said, the projected inflation is going to start to come down over time. But with unions and the labor movement and community-based organizations, there is certainly scope to advocate for more progressive approaches to inflation. So that's a brief recap of the report. You can access the full report on the CCPA website at this link here, and I'm very happy to take any questions you may have now.
Thank you so much, Jesse Hager, Assistant Professor in Economics and Labor Studies at the University of Manitoba and Research Associate with our office, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Manitoba office. Thanks to those of you who joined as we're going there. Welcome, everyone. I just put the instructions for questions in the chat, and we have 2 questions to start off, but just give you the instructions so you can think about questions for Jesse. So yeah, you can put questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I will ask you to unmute when your time is, and just keep your questions brief and respectful, please. So at this point, we have Niall Harney, who is the new Errol Black Chair in Labor Issues and Senior Researcher with our office, to ask a couple questions to Jesse to get us started. So over to you now.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse, for this talk and for some progressive analysis on this issue, which has really been lacking in recent months. First question I have for you is related to another hot issue, which is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You showed in your report that gas prices were the most significant contributor to inflation over the last year or so. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how the invasion might affect gas prices going forward, and how that changes projections for inflation.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the bulk of my analysis was done before the surprising and shocking events that have unfolded in Ukraine. But from a purely cost of living perspective and policy perspective, that war and what it's doing on the supply side of the economy isn't really that much different than the type of shocks that we've seen throughout the pandemic. They're focused on and arising from the supply side of the economy, and they're reflecting real changes, right? They're reflecting the idea that things are harder to get, right? There's problems out there, whether it's this horrific war, or whether it's ships not being able to unload their cargo on our coasts. These are all price changes that are arising because something is becoming harder to buy. And in those situations, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to raise interest rates or try to slow down the economy to bring prices under control. Basically, what you're doing is you're saying, we're going to try to reduce the prices of something else to compensate for these high prices based on something that's happening outside of our borders, outside of our control. And in Canada, for example, well, what are you basically doing? You're basically going to drive down the wages of service sector workers. That's what you're going to do when you take these more conservative policy approaches. And I would argue that's still the wrong approach. What the invasion of Ukraine is going to do, though, it is another shock, right? Just like Omicron was another shock, it's going to push back the forecasts for when inflation comes under control. It's going to make those forecasts a little bit higher in the shorter term. But from my perspective, it doesn't change the overall policy analysis of the situation and what we should do.
Okay, thanks for that. My second question is around the corporate profiteering part of your analysis. It really seems here that corporations are taking advantage of spending increases as the pandemic winds down. And we have a serious problem with corporate concentration here in Canada, especially in groceries, in telecommunications, in transportation. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on sort of what tools government has to address that corporate profiteering. I've heard commentators in the U.S. talk about a windfall profits tax to try and disincentivize corporations from price gouging, or you talked about price controls. I'm curious to know what kind of historical precedent there is, and what tools are available.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And I do think it's central to what is going on here. If you think about inflation as a problem and the broader setting of prices in the economy, it really comes down to this issue of who's going to get the share of what's being produced in the economy. Is it going to go to profits? Is it going to go to those who own the factories and the assets out there? Or is it going to go to the people who are making the stuff? And what we've seen is that during the pandemic, sure, workers have been able to negotiate wage increases, and their ability to do that has been helped by the pandemic in some ways. People are less willing to do crappy jobs at very low pay, because not only now are you in that situation, you're actually putting your health at risk as well now, and being treated likely more poorly by some customers because you're forcing them to wear masks and that type of thing. So it's been harder to get people to go to work. It's been harder for people to go to work because of health issues, that they may be immunocompromised. They may have family obligations that make it hard for them to work during the pandemic. So all these things have contributed to increasing the bargaining power of labor. But what we have seen is that corporate profits have increased, and it's really interesting to hear these CEOs and CFOs talk to their shareholders when they present their earning reports, and it's very clear that they are jacking up prices more than they need to cover their costs, and it raises this policy question as you suggest. So a windfall tax on profits, higher corporate taxes, certainly an important policy option that's out there. And that's a long-standing problem, right? Where we've had our tax system become more and more skewed towards benefiting the wealthy and benefiting corporations over time. And that just makes it easier for people to profit at the expense of consumers in these ways. So that's a short-term solution that could happen fairly quickly. I think taxing those profits, using the revenues to fund public services to create competition in areas where these private sector companies have huge amounts of market power, like telecommunications again is an important area, and just acting as a check. Like, even if you're not going to take over the whole market, the Saskatchewan example again, they have the same private companies competing, but they're offering lower prices because Saskatchewan has a public provider to compete with them. So that provision of services, the ability to just rein in corporate power more generally, what we see is over time, over the last 30, 40 years, our whole legislative and political system is becoming more and more favorable to corporate influence. So undoing those gains, there's many different ways to do that, but it requires a wholesale reevaluation of the power of corporations, and then price controls you mentioned last, which it's funny, you go back to World War II and you look at surveys of price controls, they're incredibly popular with people, and that's it really was not favored by the owners of businesses, and that's really why it ended up not sticking around after the fact. But we do have some areas in Manitoba even where we do still have price controls, and they're not creating problems and they're supporting access and equity to important goods and services. So I think that's an area where you at least you have it there as an option to use to help get prices under control.
Thank you so much, Jesse, for your responses, and to Nal Harney for those questions.